Hello everyone. First, I have some announcements to make. Unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, I'm only going to be able to focus on Marvel Comics. I should have said this a few months ago, but I have been unable to continue my Man with the Yellow Hat is a Jerk series because my printer scanner is not working. I also can't do the DC reviews I wanted this coming year, though I may be able to save up and buy a scanner soon. A printer scanner is just too unreliable. My printer is out of ink, and it's made so you can't use a scanner till the printer is full of ink. But my printer only has room for tiny ink cartridges my local stores do not have. Plus, ink cartridges cost way too much money. I apologize, but it's just how it is. Now, on to the bad retcons I wish to talk about. Because it's obviously one of my least favorite retcons, One More Day is not on this list. There is a retcon on this that I consider worse than One More Day, and I will talk about it later in this video. Now on to my least favorite Marvel retcons. Number 8. It getting retcon that Spider-Man and Gwen Stacy were never cloned. Yeah, in the late 80s, they retconned it so that Spider-Man and his former love interest, Gwen Stacy, weren't cloned in the 70s clone saga. Some innocent people were brainwashed into thinking they were Spider-Man and Gwen. It's a head-shaking moment in Marvel history, as it's because Marvel editorial considered it too unrealistic for anyone to be cloned. In a world where a man is struck by a radioactive bomb, and instead of dying, he turns into a gray monster at night. Then later turns into a green monster at night. Because that's way more realistic than human cloning. I'm putting this low on the list because I haven't read the actual comic that did it. I admit, I know about it because of Linkara bringing it up in his first ever video review. The real reason I'm putting this low on the list is that only 8 years later, the 90s Clone Saga retconned it out, and also retconned a lot of other things from the original Clone Saga out, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, this is just a stupid retcon that really is kind of head-scratching. Anyway, on to the next one. Number 7. Eddie Brock's origin changing, so he went to the church to ask God to kill Spider-Man instead of asking God for forgiveness for wanting to commit suicide. Yeah, this is one that was only done to make the comics like Spider-Man 3. Another thing that happened because of Spider-Man 3 is that Spider-Man was wearing his black costume in the comics but not the symbiote one, but the one Black Cat made him years ago, that he got rid of after he first met and defeated Venom, because of Mary Jane being freaked out by it, because he ends up confronting Mary Jane and scaring her half to death in his first appearance. Whoopsie on the writer, the editor, and everyone in Marvel editorial making that mistake. Anyway, back to what I was talking about. As you know, in Spider-Man 3, Eddie Brock goes to a church to ask God to kill Peter Parker. I was never a fan of that in Spider-Man 3, nor of Topher Grace playing Eddie Brock, so I didn't want the comics to be changed to be just like it. Also, in an earlier story written by early in J. Michael Straczynski's run, he was mandated to give Spider-Man organic web shooters like the movies did. Funnily enough, that mandate was undone at the end of One More Day, where Mephisto got rid of the organic web shooters in favor of his mechanical ones. Why did Mephisto do this? Who knows? I can't say for sure, but I suspect that it was one of the many things Joe Quesada forced on J. Michael Straczynski when forcing him into writing One More Day. Anyway, on to the next one. Number 6. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver going from being Magneto's kids to being someone else's kids. Yeah, this was a jerk retcon that was only done sometime about 11 years ago because of Marvel not having the rights to X-Men, so that they wanted to change the comics. So they went from Wanda and Pietro being Magneto's kids to not being mutants at all and being products of some experiment. I admit it wasn't until the early 80s that they made them Magneto's kids, but they were always mutants well before then. By the way, I own the comic where they made Magneto their father. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver #1 if you are interested, from the 1980s. By the way, they cancelled the Fantastic Four comics then, much to my friend Mike's and every other Fantastic Four comics fan's dismay, for the same reason of the film rights issues. Anyway, even though it bothers me, it's not as bad as some of these others. On to the next one. Number 5. Mysterio's death and Marvel Knights Daredevil #8 getting undone. Yeah, this was a story I wasn't familiar with till around 7 years ago when borrowing Marvel Knights Daredevil #1 through Tony from my friend Mike, who I just mentioned. The thing is, in issue number 6 of that series, the longtime villain Bullseye kills Karen Page. At the end of the 7th issue, it is revealed that Mysterio/Quentin Beck was behind it all, and had also kidnapped a baby girl whose mother he killed. Daredevil tracks him down at the end of the issue. Then in issue number 8, after fighting with a bunch of his men, he confronts Mysterio, who tells him he knows his secret identity and that he has to listen to him or he'll kill the baby girl. He also kills all the men Daredevil just fought because he revealed Daredevil's identity to them too, which I admit is kind of stupid on his part. After hearing his reasons behind it, which basically amount to him wanting to ruin a superhero's life after not succeeding to do so to Spider-Man, Matt rants and raves at Mysterio that he is just a failure and that his whole life has just been a waste. And also that he's just the product of too many movies and too many TV shows. And that he's just a mass murderer who deserves nothing good. This causes Mysterio to get so depressed he kills himself. It's hard for me to pity because he did a lot of horrible things, and I didn't mention it, but he was dying of cancer, and I apologize to anyone who has had loved ones die of cancer if that upsets you. I have no idea why Brian Michael Bendis, who wrote this story, decided to have this irredeemable villain have cancer, and instead of reforming, does even more horrible things than he had done before. I don't hate this story, but that premise of Mysterio having cancer bothers me, as I have had loved ones die of cancer. But they later undid his death, but it was after one more day, so I won't be covering it any time in the future. Still, it does kind of ruin a classic Daredevil story. Also, I do read current Daredevil comics, and no, they never brought Karen Page back. Anyway, on to the next one. Number 4. The motive of Uncle Ben's killer and Amazing Spider-Man number 200 and 201. Yeah, this isn't exactly a retcon, but it has a big problem. I don't mind giving Uncle Ben's killer a motive, but the problem with it is that the writer Marv Wolfman did a bad job of the motive of Uncle Ben's killer. It's that Uncle Ben's killer broke into Uncle Ben's and Aunt May's house because he thinks they have a bunch of cash that a mobster in the late 1920s left in their house. The problem is that story came out in 1980, and 1920s cash in 1980 would be utterly useless, since after over 50 years that currency would not be valid. It baffles me. Marv Wolfman, the man who did write a lot of good comics, would write something that stupid. I mean, you don't have to have a master's degree in American history to know that cash in the late 1920s would not be valid after 50 plus years. I like these comics, but that is a really stupid plot point. Not only that, but Marv Wolfman doesn't even have Peter acknowledge the fact that the cash he wants is utterly useless to him. I wish they just have it be that the mobster stole a bunch of diamonds and hid them in the house instead. But cash? Ugh. I like the rest of the story, but that motive and the way it was written was stupid. On to the next one. Number 3. The Jackal's entire story getting retconned in the 90s Clone Saga. Yeah, I've been wanting to talk about this for a while, and any of you who have watched Linkara's reviews know about it. But the way they did the Jackal when they brought him back in the 90s was so baffling and stupid. For those who don't know, let me explain it. I said this in my Amazing Spider-Man number 166 review, but in the 1970s, Gary Conway was forced by Marvel Editorial to bring back Gwen because there was fan backlash to her death. But instead of bringing her back from the dead, he had a college professor named Miles Warren, who was a teacher to both Gwen and Peter in college, get really upset at Gwen's death. Also, something Linkara never brought up is that in the original story, it was not Miles Warren who cloned Gwen and Peter. It was his assistant, Dr. Serba, who Miles tricked into cloning them. He did that by lying to him and saying they were from a rat. The specimens, I mean. He did this because he deeply missed Gwen and couldn't stand that she was killed by the Green Goblin and that Peter as Spider-Man was responsible. He had a plan to get back at Peter because he was jealous of the fact that Gwen loved him. Anyway, when they form into human clones, Serba objects to making human clones, and Miles reacts by grabbing Serba by the neck and choking him to death. Then the story ends with the clone of Gwen telling Jackal he is a monster. He realizes the error of his ways and sacrifices himself to save the clone of Gwen, Peter, his clone, and Ned Leeds, who he had also abducted. We go from that to the second issue of the three-part story Smoke and Mirrors in the 90s, where Jackal was brought back, where he makes a clone of Gwen in front of Peter and his clone, then laughs hysterically as the clone of Gwen melts into a puddle of goo. What? Did the writer, editor, or Marvel Editorial even read the original story when they wrote and approved this? Why does he find this funny? The reason I can think of is they wanted the Jackal to be a Joker-like insane lunatic who wants to both bring pain and misery to Peter and his clone, and who also wants to kill everyone on Earth and replace them all with clones. Never mind the fact that when he cloned Gwen in the 1970s, she immediately hated him, left him, and went to Peter Parker. Yet, here he is thinking he can just kill and clone everyone, and his entire story and motive is completely gotten rid of. Frankly, I like the clone of Peter who is named Ben Reilly. Just to let you know, Reilly is Aunt May's maiden name. Anyway, the Jackal should not have been brought back if they were going to ignore his entire original story and make him into someone he wasn't. They also killed him off at the end of the Clone Saga, and then brought him back after one more day, because some people at Marvel don't know what a good idea is. On to the next one. Number 2, Jessica Drew's / Spider-Woman's father being retconned to being an evil villain. Yeah, I admit, I didn't get into Spider-Woman until about 7 years ago. Not long after buying and starting to read Essential Spider-Woman Volume 1, my friend Mike and his then friend Joe started a podcast and ended up reviewing a Spider-Woman comic from the 2000s by Brian Michael Bendis. By the way, you can find the review of it on YouTube, and it's a channel called We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones. Anyway, after listening to their review and finding out about how they changed her origin from what it was in those comics and that trade I owned, I was mad. In those original comics, Jessica Drew, as a little girl, was dying of a disease, and her father, who had been forced by Hydra into working for them, sacrificed everything to save her life by putting her into an experiment he was forced by Hydra to create in order to make a being who had spider powers. It worked, and he was grateful. Years later, after having been brainwashed by Hydra and working for them for years, Nick Fury infiltrates a base she is at. He succeeds in convincing her that Hydra are the bad guys and that she has been brainwashed. Later, she is able to remember him as the good person he was and know about what he did for her and all the sacrifices he made for her. Then we go from that to him being an immoral jerk who cared more about his work than his wife and daughter, and that he deserved his death that happened later. Oh, and they also retconned that Miles Warren, who I had mentioned earlier, who was just a college professor, also helped her father in the experiment that gave her her powers, even though that contradicts a ton of previous Spider-Man comics. Oh, and the High Evolutionary was involved in that experiment too. Because of what Brian Michael Bendis did to her father, I, for a while, refused to buy any modern Spider-Woman comics after reading the first two essential volumes that collected her original series. I let her calm down and did buy some modern ones, such as her last series that was cancelled after only 15 issues. And I'd rather they'd release another series for her and Julia Carpenter, who I'll talk about another time. This retcon is pretty bad because, like I said, it turned her father from a good person into a bad person, and all because Brian Michael Bendis wanted it to be dark. And now, the absolute worst Marvel retcon is them retconning it that Madeline Pryor was actually a clone of Jean Grey. This one is technically not a retcon, but it should count as one as it's really forced. So, Marvel Editorial decided to have Jean Grey come back when Cyclops was married to Madeline Pryor and had a son with her. And they decided in Fantastic Four number 286 to bring Jean Grey back at that time. And like I said, Cyclops was married to Madeline Pryor and had a son with her, as you see in these images here. And I consider this worse than One More Day, because his son's life is ruined because of Jean Grey coming back. It is a very frustrating thing to happen, especially to fans at the time. Oh, and by the way, Chris Claremont, who you see a picture of here, he actually almost quit Marvel because of this. He could not stand them ruining Cyclops' character by bringing Jean Grey back when he had already had him marry Madeline Pryor and also decided to have a baby son with her. And I can't blame him for wanting to quit, although if I were him, I would have quit. This was a stupid jerk decision, and I consider it worse than One More Day as it ruined his son Nate's life. And it also ruined the life of Madeline Pryor, who, as you see here, became a villain at the time they decided to have her turn out to be a clone of Jean Grey. And it was done by Mr. Sinister, who I know some of you might not know, but he is a big X-Men villain and has been since the late 80s, and he was in the 90s cartoon. I admit, though, I have not read these comics that I'm showing with Mr. Sinister, and like with some first appearances, his first appearance isn't that great because he's only in it for like a few panels and that's it. Yeah, it's one of those kinds of first appearances. Anyway, Mr. Sinister is a good villain, but that's beside the point. Sorry for backtracking there. He's basically just a scientist that is a servant of Apocalypse, I'm not kidding, and was made to look the way you see him here because of Apocalypse. Anyway, this decision was very bad. They should not have brought Jean Grey back when Cyclops was married and had a kid. And they should not have ruined his wife's and son's lives by bringing her back. And yeah, this was all Marvel Editorial. None of the writers at the time that I know of liked it either. And so, yeah, this is a really bad retcon that only exists because of editorial interference. And like I said, I do consider it worse than One More Day as it ruined characters' lives. Anyway, yeah, this retcon is bad, and I really don't like it, and that's why it's number one. I think this is the worst of all of them. Anyway, whether we like it or not, sometimes comic companies like Marvel or DC or Image end up making decisions we don't like. Well, this one was actually kind of rough with how I don't like these retcons. So, next time, I'm going to do something fun. I'm going to look at the Punisher's second and third appearance where he teams up with Spider-Man for the first time. See you then. Also, like and subscribe.